Okay, for this video lecture, we're going to be talking about the critical thinking process. So what I'm going to ask that you do is download a copy of the PowerPoint notes that start off saying the critical thinking process. What you're going to notice is that there are blanks in your notes. So you're going to want to listen to the lecture, follow along, and as you hear something, you're going to need to fill in those blanks as you go. When you're done, you'll have a completed set of notes that are an exact replica of what I'm using for my lesson. Okay? So, get out something to write with and get out your notes, and we're going to begin. So, the critical thinking process, it's composed of a couple different parts. The first thing that we're going to look at will be analysis. When we talk about conducting an analysis, we're trying to learn as much as possible about a particular subject. And there are a couple different ways that we do that. The first thing that we start with is we break that subject down into its parts. And that allows us to better understand and process the information. Okay? The description that I like to use in class a lot, and you probably heard me use at this point, would be similar to eating a piece of pie. Okay? You certainly don't take a whole pie, a piece of cake, a whole cake, and shove it into your mouth at once. It's going to make a mess. Most of the cake's going to fall to the side or fall down your lap, when the goal was to get all of it inside of you, right? So that you can have something good to eat. Well, when you try to read an entire chapter of a book, and when you're done with that chapter, then ask yourself, okay, what was that about? There's a pretty good chance that a lot of the information is going to fall off to the side. You're not going to be able to get it all in. Okay? So as we're analyzing something, as we read, we're asking questions. We're breaking it apart. Okay? So things that you want to look for, it's what I call the 5 W's and the H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. And these help us to break a subject down into its parts so that we can better understand it. And so we ask ourselves, examples, who would be the narrator? Or who is the subject of this particular passage? What is the topic or thesis of the essay that I'm reading? Where does it take place? When does it take place? And these first 4 are probably going to be the easiest ones for you to figure out, okay? These are the ones that are going to be the most evident to you. Now the next 2 are going to be more difficult. They're going to take more time over the course of the semester for you to really work on figuring out. And that is, why is the author writing this essay? Their purpose, okay? When we talk about author's purpose, we're trying to figure out why are they doing this? And how is the writer presenting their essay? What methods or styles are used? What sort of tone is present? What type of essay is it? These are the questions you ask, and how. It's how it was written. All right. So that why and the how section are going to be the 2 that'll probably challenge most of you most often throughout the course of the semester. But that's analysis. Those are the questions that we use to break down our subject into smaller parts to better understand it. Okay? So, at this point you want to turn your page over to your notes. We're going to look at the critical thinking process for inference. Okay? So, inference is essentially requiring you to read between the lines. That's what it means boiled down. It's when you draw conclusions about a subject based on the information that you have, your experience, your knowledge of the creator's background, biases, and what information you discover from your analysis. So remember, the analysis, we break the subject down into smaller parts. When we begin to make an inference, we're putting those parts together and trying to figure out what do they mean. Okay? And so one example of that would be Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. You guys may have seen that one a few years ago. What's interesting is if you look at that movie compared to its predecessor, the first one, Batman Begins, Dark Knight has far, far more scenes that take place at nighttime. And so this seems to highlight a theme of darkness that Nolan's conveying in the film. So I'm making an inference. I look at each of the different scenes throughout Dark Knight, and I say to myself, well, that'll seem to take place at nighttime, right? The other movie, there are daytime scenes, so it's a little brighter. And what do we know about nighttime? It's when things tend to happen that aren't so good, right? It's when trouble begins. Criminals take, action in nighttime. And so we're really dealing with darkness, and they're really trying to convey a heavy, dark, negative tone. And certainly, for those of you that have watched the film, that bears out. Okay, so that's what we talk about when we say inference. Next, synthesis. And this is going to be, it's a really fancy sounding word, okay? But you've heard this word used before in other places. Photosynthesis, that's the process, light comes in and plants create food based on combining that with carbon dioxide. There's synthesizers. For those of you familiar with music, those are kind of those keyboards that help blend different sounds together to create one song. Okay, and what synthesis is, it's that process when you start to use your perspective, your point of view, to link different subjects under a common theme or relationship. Okay, so I'm going to go back to using Batman films, right? Since big blockbuster this summer and a lot of you probably seen it. But when we go ahead and look at the way Christopher Nolan represented Batman in Batman Begins and Dark Knight and now Dark Knight Rises, it's very clear that he takes his character in a much moodier, more realistic and gritty direction than any of the previous Batman movies. If you ever seen any of the ones from the 90s, they're kind of very cartoonish and kind of comical. Okay, and so we look at three separate movies, three separate subjects, and we see what do they all have in common. Again, you kind of you are inferring, but now instead of inferring the parts of one subject, it's bringing together multiple subjects to create one common relationship. Does that make sense? It's okay. This is a little more difficult, and this is going to take a little bit more time. As we go through the semester, and you've read a couple different essays out of our texts, or different articles that I've assigned, I may challenge you to say, what are some different ways in which these seemingly different articles talk about similar issues? I'm asking you to synthesize using your perspective. And then the last piece is evaluation. Now, let me be really clear. This is the part that everybody wants to jump to first. When I ask you, what did you think about today's reading? And we teachers do that all the time. We're going to ask you for your opinion. All right. A lot of times, it's a little unfair. It's a trick question. All right. Because what we want to know is, walk us through your thinking process as it relates to that subject. But what a lot of students do is they skip their analysis, they skip the inferencing and synthesizing, multiple essays, and they jump right to evaluating, and they tell you whether they like it or not, or whether it was a good book, or whether it wasn't a good reading assignment. And that's a problem. You'll notice there are three other lengthy steps that you had to get to before you can begin to then evaluate a particular subject. So when you want to determine the adequacy, significance, and value of a subject, you're evaluating it. And to do that, you would have to have completed a thorough analysis. You would have had to make certain inferences, and you would have synthesized other subjects into a greater relationship with the one you're looking at. Okay. So for example, again, going back to these Batman films, if we take a look at the way Christopher Nolan put together these Batman films in relation to the ones from the 90s. I'm thinking of the Batman and Robin with George Clooney, Arnold Schwarzenegger. They're awful. They're such a train wreck. They're funny, but they're not intentionally funny. And so what happens is when we can start to evaluate, we say, well, you know what? Looking at these different subjects, we can see that one film really spent a lot of time, energy, and effort on creating a realistic scene, something that could potentially happen in this real world. It really explores the psychology of superheroes. The other one from the late 90s is very much about bringing in blockbuster actors and actresses and just spending lots of money for special effects, and plots sacrificed as a result. So that's evaluating. You notice that you kind of do a little compare and contrast, looking at similarities, differences, and then you determine which ones kind of rank better than, higher or lower than the others. That's evaluating. Okay. So when I ask you, what did you think of this essay? What I'd like you to do is to tell me a little bit about the essay first. Okay, what did you get out of it? All right, how do you think it interacted with other essays we've read on similar or different topics? And then how did it fare compared to those essays? So that's a very brief overview of the critical thinking process as it relates to what we're going to be doing a lot in class. Now, one of the things I will say is that you want to be thinking about using this process not just with a traditional text. Sometimes you're going to encounter visual imagery in your day-to-day, billboards, TV, internet, whatever. And so you also want to be able to think, how can I evaluate visual media, visual experiences with a critical eye? And the way that you can do this is to really take a look at the style, supporting evidence, whatever details, claims, or arguments are present in that particular subject. So you want to ask yourself, who's the target audience? Who are they targeting with this particular piece? You want to know what the claims are being made. So what argument are they trying to propose? What assumptions does the image make? So if you think about it, we assume an audience knows something when we put up a stop sign, right? You see that bright red, we usually know that red means stop. And so there are basic assumptions being made. But if you go to a different country, they may not have the same sets of understanding. So again, knowing, the assumptions that the creators make, or the writer or the artist is making about their audience is important. What supporting evidence is present, if any? And again, how does composition affect the audience? Use of colors, are they bright? Are they dark? Is it black and white? Is it full of color? What shapes do you see? What impressions do those tend to lend? That's one of the ways in which you can evaluate visual subjects, in addition to applying the process to traditional texts. So at this time, that should go ahead and complete the video lecture on the critical thinking process. You should have been able to complete your notes at this time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know.